The year 1849 brought harsh winds across the Montana Territory, where gold fever had drawn desperate souls into untamed wilderness. Among the rolling hills and dense forests, a peculiar river wound its way through the landscape, known to local Blackfoot tribes as the water that sleeps. This waterway possessed an unsettling characteristic that would soon terrorize the growing settlement of Willowbrook. It never reflected light, appearing as a ribbon of liquid darkness, even under the brightest sun. If you're drawn to the dark mysteries of the American frontier, subscribe now for more tales from the shadowed corners of Western history. The untold stories of our past hold secrets that modern minds can barely comprehend. And today's account comes from the personal journals of 3 witnesses who lived to tell their terrifying tale. Thomas Mackenzie, a Scottish prospector with calloused hands and haunted eyes, first noticed the river's peculiar nature during his morning trek to the goldfields. Unlike every other waterway he'd encountered in 20 years of frontier life, this river seemed to absorb sunlight rather than reflect it. The surface remained perpetually black, creating an optical illusion that made depth impossible to gauge, a characteristic that local Native Americans had warned about for generations. The Blackfoot elder, Standing Wolf, had tried to caution the incoming settlers about the river's unnatural properties, sharing traditional stories passed down through centuries of tribal memory. According to their oral history, the water had been cursed during a night when the moon itself had been devoured by the river's hungry darkness. The tribal accounts spoke of a time when their ancestors witnessed something impossible, the moon's reflection being pulled into the water and never emerging again. But gold-hungry prospectors rarely heeded indigenous warnings, dismissing such tales as primitive superstition designed to keep valuable mining territories unexplored. The newcomers saw only opportunity in the pristine wilderness, unaware that some natural phenomena defied rational explanation and demanded respectful distance. Their skepticism would soon transform into bone-deep terror as the river began to reveal its true nature. Jonathan Prescott arrived in Willowbrook with his young wife Sarah and their 8-year-old son Timothy, carrying dreams of striking it rich in Montana's promising gold fields. The family had traveled for months across treacherous terrain, following whispered rumors of untapped veins near the mysterious Dark River. Jonathan's determination to provide a better life for his family blinded him to the subtle warnings that nature itself seemed to whisper around that cursed waterway. On the morning of July 15th, Timothy wandered toward the river while his parents prepared their mining equipment, drawn by childlike curiosity about the strange water that looked like flowing obsidian. Sarah noticed his absence first, her maternal instincts immediately sensing danger as she called his name across the quiet settlement. The boy's voice echoed back from the direction of the river, but something in its tone carried an otherworldly quality that made her blood run cold. When the frantic parents reached the riverbank, they found Timothy standing motionless at the water's edge, staring into the impenetrable black surface with an expression of profound fascination. His small hands hung limply at his sides, and his breathing had slowed to an almost imperceptible rhythm, as if he'd fallen into some kind of hypnotic trance. Sarah's desperate calls failed to rouse him from his strange stupor, and Jonathan's attempts to physically move the boy met unexpected resistance. The child's lips moved silently, forming words that neither parent could understand, syllables that seemed to belong to no earthly language they'd ever encountered. Timothy's eyes had taken on a glassy, distant quality, reflecting nothing despite the bright morning sun overhead, mirroring the river's own light-absorbing properties. For nearly an hour, the family remained locked in this surreal tableau, with the parents growing increasingly desperate to break whatever spell had captured their son. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, Timothy's trance ended, and he collapsed into his mother's arms, remembering nothing of the experience but complaining of vivid dreams about walking beneath dark water. The incident marked the beginning of a pattern that would plague Willowbrook's residents. Unexplained encounters with the river that left survivors changed in subtle but disturbing ways. The western frontier was revealing that some American folklore emerged from encounters with forces that rational minds struggled to comprehend. Standing Wolf, the Blackfoot elder whose weathered face bore the wisdom of 70 winters, approached the settlement 3 days after Timothy's strange episode with urgent purpose. His translator, a mixed-blood trader named Baptiste Moreau, struggled to convey the gravity of the elder's warnings about the river that the tribe called Mniwakan Sapa, the sacred dark water. The old man's eyes held deep concern as he gestured towards the waterway, speaking in rapid Blackfoot punctuated by emphatic hand movements that needed no translation. According to Standing Wolf's account, the river had claimed victims for generations, always targeting those who gazed too long into its lightless depths during certain celestial conditions. The tribal oral history contained detailed warnings about specific times when the water became particularly dangerous, during new moons, solar eclipses, and other astronomical events when natural light seemed somehow diminished or altered. These traditional stories, passed down through countless generations, provided survival knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in the untamed wilderness. Baptiste translated the elder's most chilling revelation. The river didn't simply drown its victims in the conventional sense, but rather drew something essential from them: their ability to reflect or interact normally with light itself. Survivors of river encounters often exhibited the same light-absorbing properties as the water, becoming living shadows that disturbed both humans and animals with their unnatural presence. This explained Timothy's glassy, unreflective eyes and the strange quality that had surrounded him during his trance-like episode. The Blackfoot believed the phenomenon originated during a night when their ancestors witnessed the moon's reflection being pulled into the river, never to reappear in any body of water again. That celestial theft had cursed the waterway, transforming it into a conduit for forces that existed beyond human comprehension or control. Standing Wolf's tribe had learned to avoid the river entirely during dangerous periods, marking safe and unsafe times through careful observation of lunar cycles and other natural signs. Most unsettling was the elder's warning about what he called the calling, a supernatural compulsion that the river exerted on certain individuals, drawing them back repeatedly until it finally claimed them completely. Timothy's trance represented the beginning of this process, and without proper protective measures, the boy would inevitably return to the water's edge, pulled by forces stronger than conscious will. The convergence of true horror stories and historical events was creating a nightmare that defied the rational worldview of 19th century settlers. Dr. Cornelius Ashworth, a learned man from Harvard who had come west to study geological formations, became fascinated by the river's unusual optical properties and dismissed the indigenous warnings as primitive folklore. His scientific mind sought rational explanations for phenomena that local tribes attributed to supernatural causes, believing that careful observation and measurement could reveal natural processes behind the mysterious darkness. The Doctor's academic arrogance would soon collide with forces that challenged everything he thought he knew about the physical world. Ashworth spent hours each day at the riverbank, taking detailed notes about water temperature, flow rate, and mineral content while attempting to understand why the surface refused to reflect light. His instruments detected unusual magnetic properties in the water itself, along with trace minerals that didn't appear in any of his geological reference texts. The scholar's methodical approach initially yielded promising data, but strange gaps began appearing in his journal entries. Entire afternoons that he couldn't remember spending by the water. Other settlers noticed disturbing changes in Dr. Ashworth's appearance and behavior as his river studies continued throughout the summer months of 1849. His normally ruddy complexion grew increasingly pale and waxy, while his eyes developed the same unreflective quality that Timothy had exhibited after his trance experience. The Doctor's speech patterns changed subtly, incorporating odd pauses and inflections that made conversations feel somehow disconnected from reality, as if his words were reaching listeners from across a vast distance. Sarah Prescott, still shaken by her son's encounter with the river, tried to warn Dr. Ashworth about the dangers of prolonged exposure to the water's influence. But the scholar dismissed her concerns with condescending explanations about mass hysteria and the psychological effects of frontier isolation on untrained minds. His academic credentials had convinced him that education and reason provided immunity against whatever forces troubled the local population, a fatal assumption that would soon prove catastrophically wrong. The Doctor's final journal entry, discovered weeks later, contained increasingly erratic handwriting and observations that defied scientific logic, descriptions of seeing things moving beneath the water's surface that cast no shadows, and references to conversations with entities that spoke without voices. His transformation from skeptical scientist to something far stranger illustrated how the dark waters of the American frontier could challenge and ultimately destroy even the most rational minds. The ghost stories emerging from the Western Territories carried truths that formal education had never prepared anyone to face. August 13th brought an astronomical event that local Blackfoot traditions had long feared. A new moon coinciding with a rare planetary alignment that plunged the Montana Territory into unusual darkness. Standing Wolf had warned the settlement to remain indoors during this celestial convergence, but most residents ignored the indigenous elder's urgent pleas, viewing his concerns as primitive superstition. The night would prove that some American folklore emerged from genuine encounters with forces beyond human comprehension. Thomas Mackenzie noticed the phenomenon first during his late evening patrol around the settlement's perimeter, when he realized that absolutely nothing in Willowbrook cast reflections anymore. Not windows, not metal surfaces, not even puddles of ordinary rainwater. The effect seemed to radiate outward from the direction of the dark river, creating an expanding zone where the normal interactions between light and matter simply ceased to function. The prospector's weather-beaten hands trembled as he held up his polished pocket watch, seeing only empty air where his own face should have appeared. Dr. Ashworth chose that accursed night to conduct what he called his definitive experiment, convinced that the unusual astronomical conditions would finally reveal the scientific truth behind the river's mysterious properties. Ignoring desperate pleas from other settlers, the scholar positioned himself at the water's edge with his instruments and notebooks, determined to document whatever phenomena occurred during the celestial alignment. His colleagues would later find his equipment scattered along the riverbank, but the doctor himself had vanished without leaving any conventional trace. Throughout Willowbrook, residents experienced disturbing dreams that felt more real than their waking moments. Visions of walking through landscapes where light behaved according to alien rules, and familiar objects cast shadows that moved independently. Children woke screaming about the hungry water that wanted to drink their reflections, while adults found themselves compulsively drawn towards their windows, staring in the direction of the cursed river with the same hypnotized expression that had overcome young Timothy weeks earlier. By dawn, the reflection-stealing effect had spread throughout the entire settlement, leaving every resident unable to see their own image in any reflective surface, while experiencing an overwhelming compulsion to approach the dark water. The western frontier was revealing that historical horror often emerged from encounters with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of rational explanation, challenging the assumptions of civilization itself. The nightmare that had begun with one child's trance was expanding to encompass an entire community, transforming ordinary people into something that no longer belonged entirely to the world of the living. Dawn revealed a sight that would haunt Willowbrook survivors for the rest of their lives. Every child in the settlement had risen before sunrise and formed a silent procession toward the dark river, moving with synchronized steps that suggested external control rather than conscious volition. Timothy Prescott led the group, his 8-year-old frame moving with adult purpose, as 17 other children followed in perfect formation, their eyes reflecting nothing despite the growing morning light. Parents who tried to intercede found themselves physically unable to approach their own offspring, as if an invisible barrier separated the children from the adult world. Sarah Prescott's screams echoed across the settlement as she watched her son march toward the cursed water with mechanical precision, his small face wearing an expression of profound serenity that terrified her more than any display of fear or pain could have. The boy's lips moved constantly, forming silent words in that same otherworldly language he had spoken during his first encounter with the river weeks earlier. Other parents joined Sarah's desperate attempts to break through whatever force controlled their children, but their efforts proved futile against the supernatural compulsion that had claimed the settlement's youngest residents. Standing Wolf arrived at the riverbank just as the children's procession reached the water's edge, the elderly Blackfoot warrior carrying sacred items from his tribe's most powerful protective ceremonies. Baptiste Moreau translated the elders' urgent chanting, explaining that Standing Wolf was attempting to invoke ancient spiritual barriers that his ancestors had used to contain the river's malevolent influence during similar events in the distant past. The traditional remedies represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about surviving encounters with forces that existed beyond normal human experience. The children stopped inches from the water's surface, standing motionless as the dark river began to exhibit new and terrifying properties. The surface started rising upward in defiance of gravity, forming tentacle-like extensions that reached toward the hypnotized youth with obvious hunger. Thomas Mackenzie later described the sight as liquid darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence, Unlike any natural phenomenons he had witnessed during decades of frontier life, the water's behavior suggested conscious intent rather than simple physical forces, implying that whatever entity controlled the river possessed awareness and deliberate malevolence. Standing Wolf's protective ritual created a temporary barrier that held the rising water at bay, but the Elder's weathered face showed the tremendous strain of maintaining spiritual defenses against such powerful supernatural forces. The confrontation between indigenous wisdom and otherworldly malevolence would determine whether Willowbrook's children could be saved from a fate worse than simple drowning. The complete absorption of their essence into the hungry darkness that had plagued this corner of the American frontier for generations. Dark West legends were proving themselves to be survival guides disguised as folklore, containing practical knowledge about threats that formal education had never prepared anyone to recognize or resist. Standing Wolf's protective chant grew increasingly strained as the dark water pressed against his spiritual barriers with relentless determination, testing every weakness in the ancient Blackfoot defenses that had contained the river's malevolence for countless generations. The elderly warrior's voice cracked with exhaustion, but his resolve remained unshakable as he drew upon 7 decades of accumulated spiritual knowledge to protect the settlement's children from a fate that transcended ordinary death. Sweat poured down his weathered face despite the cool morning air, evidence of the tremendous metaphysical battle being waged at the water's edge. Baptiste Moreau watched in growing alarm as Standing Wolf began to exhibit the same light-absorbing properties that had marked Dr. Ashworth and other river victims, the Elder's body gradually taking on the same unreflective quality as the cursed water itself. The mixed blood translator realized that the protective ritual was literally consuming the old man's life force, transforming him into a living barrier between the supernatural threat and the helpless children. Standing Wolf's sacrifice represented the ultimate expression of indigenous wisdom, the willingness to give everything to protect future generations from dangers that outsiders refuse to acknowledge. The 17 children remained frozen in their supernatural trance, but subtle changes in their posture suggested that Standing Wolf's intervention was weakening the river's control over their minds and bodies. Timothy Prescott's mechanical movements became less coordinated, and several other children began blinking rapidly as if awakening from deep sleep, though their eyes still held that disturbing, unreflective quality. The Elder's spiritual battle was creating opportunities for the children to reclaim their own consciousness, but only if other adults could somehow complete what Standing Wolf had begun. Sarah Prescott found herself able to move closer to her son as the invisible barriers weakened, though each step toward Timothy felt like walking through thick syrup that resisted her maternal determination. Other parents experienced similar partial freedom from whatever force had previously prevented adult intervention, but they quickly discovered that physical contact with their children produced painful electrical sensations that suggested the protective ritual was still incomplete. The situation remained balanced on a knife's edge, with Standing Wolf's sacrifice buying precious time that someone needed to use effectively. The old warrior's final words, translated by Baptiste through tears of respect and grief, contained specific instructions for a counter-ritual that could permanently sever the river's connection to human victims. But the ceremony required multiple participants working in perfect coordination, along with sacred materials that would be difficult to obtain before Standing Wolf's spiritual barriers collapsed entirely. The Western horror unfolding at Willowbrook was revealing that survival often depended on respecting and learning from indigenous knowledge that European settlers had too often dismissed as primitive superstition. Baptiste Moreau's desperate translation of Standing Wolf's final instructions sent the settlement into frantic activity as adults scrambled to locate the sacred materials needed for the counter-ritual before the elders' protective barriers collapsed completely. The ceremony required 4 specific items: water from a natural spring that had never reflected sunlight, ash from wood that had been struck by lightning but hadn't burned, soil from a grave that predated European settlement, and blood freely given by someone who had survived direct contact with the cursed river. Each component represented a different aspect of the supernatural forces that the Blackfoot had learned to navigate through centuries of careful observation. Thomas Mackenzie remembered seeing a small spring in a deep cave system, approximately 2 miles northeast of Willowbrook, where the water emerged from underground sources and flowed directly into hidden channels without ever reaching surface daylight. The Scottish prospector's mining experience made him the logical choice to retrieve this crucial component, but the journey would require leaving the settlement during the most dangerous phase of the supernatural crisis. His weathered hands shook slightly as he gathered rope and lanterns, knowing that failure would doom the children to a fate worse than death. Jonathan Prescott volunteered to search for lightning-struck wood in the forest surrounding Willowbrook, driven by desperate paternal love for his entranced son Timothy, and haunted by guilt over dismissing earlier warnings about the river's dangers. The task proved more challenging than expected, as truly lightning-struck wood that had resisted burning was rare and difficult to identify without extensive forest knowledge. His frantic search through dense undergrowth was complicated by the disturbing realization that normal woodland animals had completely vanished from the area, leaving behind an unnatural silence that amplified every sound of his movement. Sarah Prescott faced perhaps the most emotionally challenging tasks, locating and respectfully gathering soil from pre-European graves that Standing Wolf had indicated lay hidden in a grove of ancient cottonwood trees upstream from the settlement. The requirement for respectful approach to Native American burial sites demanded cultural sensitivity that few white settlers possessed, but Baptiste provided essential guidance about proper protocols for approaching sacred ground. Sarah's maternal desperation gave her strength to overcome her own cultural prejudices and follow indigenous customs that might save her son's life. The final component, blood freely given by a river survivor, presented the most immediate challenge since Dr. Ashworth had vanished and Timothy remained in his supernatural trance, unable to provide conscious consent for the ritual requirement. However, Baptiste realized that Standing Wolf himself qualified as a survivor, having willingly exposed himself to the river's influence during his protective ceremony. And the elderly warrior nodded weakly when asked if he would provide this final sacrifice. The convergence of practical necessity and spiritual significance illustrated how true horror stories often required extraordinary courage from ordinary people faced with impossible circumstances. Thomas Mackenzie descended into the limestone cave system with grim determination, his mining lantern casting dancing shadows on ancient rock formations that seemed to whisper warnings in languages he couldn't understand. The underground passages twisted deeper into the earth than he had anticipated, and strange acoustic properties made his footsteps echo with hollow, otherworldly tones that suggested vast hidden chambers beyond his light's reach. Water dripped constantly from unseen sources above, creating a rhythmic percussion that gradually synchronized with his heartbeat in ways that made rational thought increasingly difficult to maintain. The untouched spring lay at the cave system's deepest accessible point, emerging from a crack in the rock face with crystalline purity that had never known sunlight's touch. Mackenzie's experienced eye recognized the water's unique properties immediately. It possessed an almost supernatural clarity that made depth impossible to judge, similar to the cursed river's visual tricks but opposite in its light-reflecting behavior. His hands trembled as he filled the sacred vessel, acutely aware that any contamination from external light sources could render this component useless for the protective ritual that might save 17 children's lives. Meanwhile, Jonathan Prescott's search for lightning-struck wood became increasingly desperate as Standing Wolf's protective barriers showed obvious signs of weakening, allowing the dark river to send exploratory tendrils of liquid shadow toward the motionless children. The forest itself seemed to resist his efforts, with fallen branches crumbling to dust when touched, and standing trees revealing internal rot that made them unsuitable for the ritual's requirements. His breakthrough came when he noticed a massive oak tree that bore lightning scars, but had somehow survived the electrical assault. Its damaged wood transformed into a material that seemed to pulse with contained energy. Sarah Prescott approached the ancient burial ground with reverence and terror warring in her maternal heart, following Baptiste's careful instructions about proper protocols for requesting permission from ancestral spirits to disturb sacred soil. The grove of cottonwood trees marked a site that predated European settlement by centuries, and the very air seemed thick with the presence of countless generations who had passed into the spirit world from this location. Her respectful approach involved specific prayers and offerings that Baptiste had taught her, demonstrating how survival on the American frontier often required learning from indigenous wisdom rather than imposing foreign assumptions about the natural world. Back at the riverbank, Standing Wolf's condition deteriorated rapidly as his life force continued to fuel the protective barriers that kept the supernatural threat at bay, his body becoming increasingly translucent as if he were gradually fading from the physical world entirely. The children remained motionless, but showed subtle signs of internal struggle, as if their consciousness was fighting to break free from whatever force controlled their bodies and minds. Time was running out for both the Elders' sacrificial ritual and the gathering of sacred materials, creating a desperate race against supernatural forces that had already claimed too many victims in the expanding darkness of the Montana Territory's most cursed waterway. Baptiste Moreau watched the sky darken with unnatural speed as the storm clouds gathered directly above the cursed river, forming spiral patterns that defied meteorological explanation and suggested supernatural forces were responding to Standing Wolf's protective ritual. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes, and the air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent energy that made breathing difficult and clear thinking nearly impossible for anyone within a half-mile radius of the dark water. Wildlife that had survived the initial supernatural manifestations now fled the area entirely, leaving behind an ominous silence broken only by the children's synchronized breathing and the elders' increasingly labored chanting. The returning adults arrived at the riverbank carrying their sacred materials, just as the first unnatural lightning began striking the water's surface, each electrical discharge absorbed completely by the dark liquid without producing any reflection or illumination. Thomas Mackenzie's mining experience had never prepared him for the sight of lightning that cast no light, while Jonathan Prescott struggled to comprehend storm clouds that seemed to hang motionless despite generating continuous electrical activity. Sarah Prescott clutched her respectfully gathered grave soil with trembling hands, praying that their combined efforts would prove sufficient to save her son and the other entranced children. Standing Wolf's eyes had taken on the same unreflective quality that marked all river victims, but his voice remained strong as he began the counter-ritual that would either break the supernatural hold over Willowbrook's children or cost everyone their lives in the attempt. Baptiste translated the elder's instructions with urgent precision, explaining that each sacred material must be combined in specific sequence, while the participants maintained absolute mental focus on protective intentions rather than fearful thoughts. The ceremony represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about surviving encounters with force that existed beyond normal human comprehension. The Dark River responded to the counter-ritual with violent fury, sending massive waves of liquid shadow high into the air in complete defiance of natural physics, while the storm above began generating winds that howled with almost vocal quality. The children's trance deepened rather than weakening, and several adults noticed that their own reflections were beginning to fade from metal surfaces and standing water throughout the settlement. Whatever entity controlled the cursed waterway was making a final desperate attempt to claim every human soul in the vicinity before the protective ceremony could sever its connection to the physical world. As the sacred spring water touched the river's surface, a sound like breaking glass echoed across the Montana Territory, followed by a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch for hours, despite it lasting only seconds. The confrontation between indigenous spiritual wisdom and supernatural malevolence had reached its critical moment, with the fate of 17 children and an entire frontier settlement hanging in the balance. Western horror was revealing its true nature, not mere folklore designed to frighten listeners, but survival knowledge disguised as stories, containing practical information about threats that rational 19th century minds had never been prepared to acknowledge or resist. The instant Thomas Mackenzie's sacred spring water touched the cursed river's surface, reality itself seemed to crack like thin ice under tremendous pressure, releasing sounds and sensations that human senses had never been designed to process. The liquid darkness recoiled from the untouched water with obvious pain, creating an expanding circle of normal-looking river that reflected the storm clouds above for the first time in living memory. Standing Wolf's voice rose to match the supernatural winds as he began the final phase of the counter-ritual, his translucent form becoming even more ethereal as he channeled the last of his life force into breaking the ancient curse. Jonathan Prescott scattered the lightning-struck wood ash, according to Baptiste's desperate translation of the Elder's instructions, creating geometric patterns around the children that seemed to pulse with contained electrical energy. The ash began glowing with soft blue light that provided the first normal illumination anyone had seen in the area since the previous evening, and several of the entranced children blinked rapidly as if awakening from deep sleep. Timothy Prescott's mechanical posture relaxed slightly, though his eyes still held that disturbing unreflective quality that marked him as partially claimed by whatever force controlled the dark water. Sarah Prescott's hands shook violently as she sprinkled the sacred grave soil in the final pattern that would complete the protective barrier. But her maternal determination proved stronger than supernatural terror as she followed every detail of Baptiste's frantic instructions. The ancient earth seemed to pulse with its own life force as it touched the ground, creating visible lines of golden energy that connected with the lightning ash patterns and the expanding circle of normal water. The convergence of sacred materials was generating forces that made the air itself shimmer with protective power. Standing Wolf's final sacrifice, his own blood freely given, completed the counter-ritual just as his physical form became too translucent to maintain solid existence in the material world. The elderly Blackfoot warrior smiled peacefully as he faded from sight, his life force permanently woven into the protective barriers that would contain the cursed river's malevolent influence for generations to come. His disappearance coincided with a sound like thunder rolling backwards, followed by the most profound silence that any of the survivors could remember experiencing in their entire lives. The 17 children collapsed simultaneously, as whatever force had controlled their minds and bodies suddenly released its hold, leaving them unconscious but breathing normally for the first time since the nightmare began. Parents rushed to gather their offspring while Baptiste checked for signs of permanent damage from the supernatural possession, finding that the children's eyes had returned to normal reflective properties, but their memories of the entire experience seemed completely absent. The successful completion of Standing Wolf's protective ritual had broken the immediate threat, but questions remained about the long-term effects of exposure to forces that existed beyond human understanding. The storm clouds dispersed with unnatural speed once Standing Wolf's sacrifice took effect, leaving behind a crystalline blue sky that seemed almost too bright after the supernatural darkness that had engulfed Willowbrook for nearly 24 hours. The cursed river now appeared completely normal, reflecting sunlight and sky with the same clarity as any other Montana waterway, though none of the survivors felt inclined to approach its banks or trust its apparently benign appearance. Dr. Ashworth's abandoned scientific instruments lay scattered along the riverbank, but the scholar himself remained missing, his ultimate fate known only to the dark waters that had claimed him. Timothy Prescott awakened in his mother's arms with no memory of the supernatural events that had nearly cost him his soul, asking only why everyone looked so frightened and tired on such a beautiful morning. The other children showed similar amnesia regarding their terrifying ordeal, though several parents noticed subtle behavioral changes, increased sensitivity to shadows, reluctance to look at their own reflections, and disturbing dreams about walking underwater through landscapes that obeyed alien physical laws. These lingering effects suggested that complete recovery from supernatural trauma might require more time than physical healing from ordinary injuries. Baptiste Moreau spent hours explaining Standing Wolf's sacrifice to grieving tribal members, who arrived at Willowbrook later that day, carrying the elders' empty clothes and personal belongings back to the Blackfoot territory for proper funeral ceremonies. The mixed blood translator struggled to convey the magnitude of what Standing Wolf had accomplished, saving not only 17 children but potentially preventing the cursed river's influence from spreading throughout the entire Montana territory. Indigenous wisdom had once again proved superior to European rationalism when confronting forces that existed beyond conventional scientific understanding. Thomas Mackenzie organized a thorough search for Ashworth, but the missing scholar's trail ended abruptly at the river's edge with no physical evidence of drowning, violence, or voluntary departure from the area. The prospector's mining experience had taught him to recognize various types of disappearances, but Ashworth's vanishing defied every category of explanation that frontier life had provided. The doctor's fate served as a permanent reminder that academic credentials provided no protection against supernatural threats that demanded respect rather than rational analysis. The immediate crisis had passed, but Willowbrook's residents understood that their community had been forever changed by its encounter with forces that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. Parents held their children closer, adults checked their reflections more frequently, and everyone developed a healthy respect for indigenous warnings about dangers that couldn't be measured or catalogued by European scientific methods. The American frontier was teaching harsh lessons about the limitations of civilization when confronted with mysteries that predated human settlement by centuries or millennia. 3 days after Standing Wolf's sacrifice restored normalcy to the cursed river, Jonathan Prescott discovered Dr. Ashworth's final journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the scholar's abandoned cabin. Its pages filled with increasingly erratic observations that documented the gradual dissolution of a rational mind confronted with supernatural forces. The entries began with the typical scientific notation, but gradually deteriorated into rambling descriptions of impossible geometries and conversations with entities that existed beneath the water's surface. The final pages were written in a handwriting so distorted that Baptiste Moreau needed several attempts to decipher the scholar's last coherent thoughts. Ashworth's journal revealed that he had been experiencing the river's influence for weeks before his disappearance, describing vivid dreams where he walked through underwater cities populated by beings that cast no shadows and spoke without making sounds. The scholar's attempts to maintain scientific objectivity became increasingly desperate as his entries documented physical changes, his reflection growing fainter each day, his shadow becoming detached from his body, and his memories developing gaps that corresponded to extended periods spent staring into the dark water. The progression from skeptical rationalist to supernatural victim provided a chilling roadmap of how the cursed river claimed its prey. Most disturbing were the journal's final entries, which suggested that Dr. Ashworth had begun to welcome his transformation rather than resist it, describing the peace and clarity that came with abandoning human limitations and joining whatever collective consciousness existed within the river's depths. His handwriting during these passages took on an alien quality, with letter forms that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, making prolonged reading physically uncomfortable. The scholar's intellectual pride had apparently made him more susceptible to supernatural influence rather than more resistant, as he interpreted his gradual absorption as enlightenment rather than destruction. The journal's last legible page contained a detailed map showing other locations throughout the Montana Territory where similar supernatural phenomena had been reported, including 2 additional rivers, a mountain lake, and several natural springs that exhibited unusual light absorption properties. Dr. Ashworth had been investigating a much larger pattern of supernatural activity than anyone realized, and his disappearance might have prevented him from inadvertently awakening additional threats that could have endangered settlements throughout the region. The scholar's fate illustrated how good intentions and intellectual curiosity could prove fatal when directed toward forces that required spiritual rather than academic approaches. Baptiste carefully copied the map's contents before deciding whether to share this information with territorial authorities. Recognizing that Ashworth's research could either help other communities prepare for similar supernatural threats or inspire dangerous attempts to study phenomena that were better left undisturbed. The convergence of scientific methodology and otherworldly malevolence had created knowledge that might be too dangerous for widespread distribution, especially among people who lacked Standing Wolf's spiritual wisdom and protective training. Ghost stories from the American frontier were proving to contain practical survival information disguised as folklore, but accessing that knowledge safely required respecting indigenous traditions rather than treating them as subjects for academic study. Sarah Prescott began noticing subtle changes in Timothy's behavior within a week of the supernatural crisis. Though her son maintained complete amnesia regarding his trance experience and the events that had nearly claimed his soul, the 8-year-old boy developed an uncanny ability to predict when storms were approaching hours before any visible clouds appeared, and he consistently avoided looking directly at reflective surfaces, despite being unable to articulate why mirrors and still water made him uncomfortable. His drawings, previously typical childhood artwork, now featured impossible architectural structures that resembled the underwater cities described in Dr. Ashworth's journal. Other parents reported similar observations about their own children: enhanced sensitivity to atmospheric changes, reluctance to approach any body of water regardless of size, and disturbing accuracy when predicting which adults might be feeling sad or frightened despite attempts to hide such emotions. The children seemed to have retained some connection to supernatural awareness, even though their conscious memories of the river encounter remained completely blocked. Their enhanced perceptions might represent permanent changes resulting from brief exposure to forces that operated according to different rules than ordinary reality. Mary Catherine Walsh, the settlement school teacher, documented the children's behavior changes with growing concern as she realized that their academic performance had improved dramatically in some areas while declining in others. Mathematical and spatial reasoning skills had advanced far beyond age-appropriate levels, but reading comprehension and verbal communication showed subtle deterioration, as if their minds were adapting to process information through non-linguistic channels. The children frequently responded to questions before they were fully asked, suggesting telepathic abilities that made normal classroom instruction increasingly difficult to maintain. Most unsettling was the children's tendency to draw identical images when given independent art assignments. Geometric patterns that hurt adults' eyes to examine closely, and landscape scenes featuring dark water that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. These spontaneous artistic productions suggested that the strangest aspect of the river's curse wasn't just its darkness, but what emerged from its depths during the full moon. Martha Henderson, the schoolteacher who arrived in summer of 1850, documented peculiar encounters in her personal journal. She described small figures that would appear along the riverbank at midnight, translucent and shimmering like moonlight caught in water. These apparitions seemed to be children, but their features were distorted, as if viewed through rippling liquid. Local Blackfoot elders, when pressed for information by the more respectful settlers, spoke in hushed tones about water children, spirits of those who had drowned in sacred waters. According to their oral traditions, certain rivers served as passages between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. When such waters were defiled or disturbed, the boundary between worlds became permeable, allowing entities to cross over seeking resolution or revenge. Martha's journal entries became increasingly disturbed as autumn approached. She wrote of hearing children's laughter echoing from the river during her evening walks, though no children lived near that stretch of water. The sound would start as innocent giggles, but gradually transform into something more sinister, a wet, gurgling noise that made her skin crawl. She began avoiding the river path entirely, choosing longer routes to reach the distant homesteads where she tutored. The Henderson woman wasn't alone in these experiences. Several other settlers reported similar encounters, though most were reluctant to speak openly about them. The masculine culture of frontier life discouraged discussion of supernatural experiences, viewing them as signs of weakness or mental instability. However, private conversations between trusted neighbors revealed a pattern of supernatural activity centered around the cursed waters that defied rational explanation. Most disturbing were the reports from parents whose children claimed to have new playmates by the river. These phantom children would allegedly invite living children to come swimming in the dark waters, speaking in voices that seemed to emanate from underwater. The protective instincts of frontier parents, already heightened by the dangerous environment, became almost paranoid when it came to keeping their children away from that particular stretch of water. Reverend Josiah Blackwood arrived in the territory during the harsh winter of 1850, carrying with him not only the word of God, but also extensive knowledge of folklore and supernatural phenomena from his native New England. The weathered preacher had witnessed unexplained events during his ministry in Salem and other communities, where the veil between natural and supernatural seemed particularly thin. His gaunt frame and piercing gray eyes gave him an otherworldly appearance that some found comforting and others deeply unsettling. When Blackwood first heard accounts of the river's strange behavior, he didn't dismiss them as frontier superstition. Instead, he spent weeks studying the water, praying along its banks and interviewing anyone willing to share their experiences. His theological training had taught him that evil could manifest in many forms, and his practical experience had shown him that supernatural phenomena often had identifiable patterns and purposes that could be understood and addressed. The Reverend's investigation led him to conclude that the river had become what he termed spiritually contaminated. In his Sunday sermons, delivered in the makeshift chapel constructed from salvaged timber, he would speak about places where great suffering had occurred, explaining how trauma could literally soak into the landscape. His words carried weight because he spoke from both biblical authority and personal experience with similar phenomena in other regions. Blackwood's most memorable sermon came on a particularly cold Sunday in February 1851, when he directly addressed the river situation. Standing before the assembled community, his breath visible in the frigid air, he warned that the waters had become a doorway for restless spirits, seeking justice for unknown wrongs. His deep voice resonated through the small building as he urged the settlers to treat the river with respect and caution. The preacher's words created a lasting impact on the community's collective psyche, transforming what had been whispered rumors into acknowledged spiritual reality. His theological framework gave the settlers a way to understand their experiences without feeling foolish or weak. However, his warnings also intensified the community's fear of the water, creating an atmosphere of supernatural dread that would persist for generations throughout the American frontier territories. The winter of 1850-1851 brought unprecedented hardships to the small settlement, and many believed the cursed river played a role in their misfortunes. temperatures dropped to levels that froze the breath in people's lungs, and supplies ran dangerously low as supply trains were delayed by massive snowstorms. The river itself became a ribbon of black ice, its surface reflecting nothing even when the rare sunny day provided brilliant light across the snow-covered landscape. Strange accidents plagued the community throughout those bitter months. Healthy livestock would be found dead near the river with no apparent cause, their bodies unmarked, but their eyes clouded white, as if they had seen something terrible before dying. Hunting parties reported that game animals avoided the entire area around the cursed waters, forcing hunters to travel much farther for food, exposing them to greater dangers from weather and hostile encounters. The psychological toll on the settlers became as severe as the physical hardships. Sleep disturbances affected nearly everyone, with people reporting dreams of drowning even though they were nowhere near water. Children became withdrawn and fearful, while adults grew increasingly irritable and suspicious of one another. The sense of community that had helped them survive previous challenges began to fracture under the weight of supernatural dread and natural adversity. Medical emergencies increased dramatically during this period, though Dr. Thornton struggled to explain many of the ailments he encountered. Patients would arrive at his cabin complaining of symptoms that seemed to have no physical cause: sudden weakness, persistent nightmares, and a peculiar condition where people claimed they could no longer see their own reflections clearly in mirrors or still water. His medical training provided no framework for understanding these mysterious maladies. The combination of harsh winter conditions and supernatural anxiety created what modern psychologists would recognize as collective trauma. The settlement existed in a state of constant tension, where every unexplained sound or shadow could trigger panic. This psychological environment made the community particularly susceptible to the influence of the dark folklore and Western horror that would define their experience of frontier life in Montana Territory. In early spring of 1851, a traveling merchant named Ezekiel Morrison arrived with the first supply wagon to reach the settlement since the previous autumn. Morrison was a man who had traversed the American frontier for over 2 decades, trading goods and stories across vast distances. His weathered face and knowing eyes suggested he had witnessed phenomena that would challenge most people's understanding of reality, making him uniquely qualified to assess the situation with the cursed river. Morrison's wagon contained not only essential supplies, but also letters and news from other settlements across the territory. As he distributed goods and correspondence, he listened carefully to the settlers' accounts of their supernatural experiences. Unlike many outsiders who might have dismissed such stories, Morrison nodded knowingly and shared his own encounters with similar phenomena in other locations throughout the expanding American West. The merchant revealed that the river's condition wasn't entirely unique in frontier territories. He had encountered other bodies of water that seemed to harbor dark energies, particularly in areas where significant violence or tragedy had occurred. His travels had taken him through regions where Native American battles, mining accidents, and settler conflicts had left spiritual scars on the landscape that manifested in various supernatural ways, characteristic of true horror stories from the period. What made Morrison's testimony particularly compelling was his practical approach to supernatural phenomena. He treated such occurrences as environmental hazards to be navigated carefully, similar to dangerous weather or hostile wildlife. This perspective helped some settlers develop coping strategies for living near the cursed waters. viewing the supernatural elements as part of the challenging but manageable reality of frontier existence in territories where American folklore was still being written. Morrison's visit provided the community with valuable perspective on their situation, helping them understand that their experiences, while extraordinary, fit into broader patterns of supernatural activity across the expanding frontier. His stories of similar occurrences in other settlements gave the people hope that their ordeal might eventually pass, while also confirming that the dark energies surrounding their river were genuine manifestations of the mysterious forces that seemed to follow westward expansion. Professor Augustus Whitmore arrived in the territory during the summer of 1851, drawn by reports of unusual natural phenomena that had reached academic circles back east. Whitmore represented a new breed of frontier investigator, educated men who applied scientific methodology to understand mysterious occurrences that others attributed purely to supernatural causes. His arrival created considerable interest among settlers hungry for rational explanations for the disturbing events they had experienced around the cursed river. Whitmore established a temporary laboratory in an abandoned cabin near the water, equipped with instruments designed to measure various environmental factors that might contribute to the river's strange properties. He collected water samples, measured temperature variations, and documented atmospheric conditions with meticulous precision. His scientific approach initially gave hope to community members who preferred rational explanations over supernatural ones, though his findings would prove more disturbing than comforting. The professor's instruments detected unusual mineral compositions in the water that defied easy categorization. Chemical analysis revealed the trace elements that shouldn't exist naturally in Montana Territory waters, suggesting geological processes that standard scientific understanding couldn't explain. Temperature readings showed inexplicable variations that seemed to follow patterns unrelated to weather conditions, solar exposure, or seasonal changes, creating what he termed thermal anomalies in his detailed research notes. Most puzzling to Whitmore were optical phenomena surrounding the river that his instruments could detect but not adequately measure. The water's inability to reflect light appeared to be more than simple surface absorption. It seemed to actively consume illumination in ways that violated established principles of physics. His attempts to document these effects using early photographic equipment yielded disturbing results that showed distortions and shadows where none should logically exist. The professor's investigation revealed that the river's mysterious properties existed at the intersection of natural science and supernatural phenomena, representing a frontier not just of geography, but of human understanding. His work contributed to the growing body of historical horror documentation that characterized the expansion into territories where European scientific knowledge encountered forces beyond its explanatory power, creating the foundation for uniquely American ghost stories rooted in frontier experience. Chief Standing Bear of the local Blackfoot Band finally agreed to meet with settlement leaders in late summer of 1851, breaking years of cautious distance maintained between his people and the white settlers. The chief was a dignified man whose weathered features spoke of decades spent reading the subtle signs of nature that white men often overlooked. His presence at the meeting carried significant weight, as his reputation for wisdom extended far beyond tribal boundaries into the broader frontier community. Through careful translation provided by a mixed-blood interpreter named Thomas Crow Feather, Chief Standing Bear explained his people's understanding of the cursed river. According to Blackfoot tradition, the water had been sacred long before white settlers arrived, serving as a place where spirits of ancestors could communicate with the living. The disruption caused by mining activities and casual use of the sacred site had angered these ancient spirits, creating the supernatural disturbances that plagued the area. The chief described specific rituals and ceremonies that his people had performed at the river for countless generations, emphasizing the careful protocols required to approach such sacred waters safely. He explained that certain locations held concentrated spiritual energy that required respectful treatment and specific ceremonies to maintain proper balance between the physical and spirit worlds. Violating these protocols had consequences that extended far beyond immediate physical effects, creating spiritual imbalances that could persist for generations. Standing Bear's account provided crucial context for understanding the historical significance of the river within Native American folklore and spiritual practice. His people had always known that the water held unusual properties, but they had developed cultural safeguards to interact safely with these forces. The arrival of white settlers who lacked this traditional knowledge had disrupted carefully maintained spiritual equilibrium, releasing energies that now affected everyone in the area. The meeting between Chief Standing Bear and settlement leaders represented a significant moment in the development of Western horror traditions, where European American encounters with indigenous spiritual knowledge created new forms of supernatural understanding. This cultural exchange contributed to the evolving body of American folklore that would define frontier experiences across territories where different spiritual worldviews collided and merged in unexpected ways. Following Chief Standing Bear's revelations, a group of desperate settlers decided to attempt the purification ritual he had described, despite his warnings that such ceremonies required proper training and spiritual preparation. Led by Reverend Blackwood and supported by several prominent community members, they planned to perform a modified version of the Blackfoot cleansing ceremony during the next new moon. Their intentions were sincere, but their understanding of the complex spiritual requirements was dangerously incomplete. The ritual participants gathered essential elements according to the chief's instructions: sacred tobacco, sweetgrass, sage, and cedar for smudging, along with offerings of food and handcrafted items to appease the disturbed spirits. They spent days preparing themselves through fasting and prayer, combining Christian spiritual practices with their limited understanding of Native American ceremonial requirements. Their hybrid approach reflected the cultural mixing that characterized frontier life, though in this case, the combination might prove more dangerous than beneficial. On the appointed night, the group assembled along the riverbank under a moonless sky that seemed darker than usual. Reverend Blackwood led prayers while others lit the sacred fire and began the smudging ceremony as they understood it. The water's surface remained completely black, reflecting neither firelight nor stars, creating an ominous backdrop for their well-intentioned but potentially foolhardy attempt to appease forces beyond their comprehension. As the ceremony proceeded, participants reported sensing a presence watching them from the water, though nothing visible appeared on the river's dark surface. The air grew noticeably colder despite the warm late summer night, and several people claimed to hear whispered voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify. The ritual seemed to be having some effect, though whether positive or negative remained unclear as supernatural energies swirled around the desperate settlers. The attempted purification ceremony represented the community's growing desperation to resolve their supernatural crisis through any means available. Their willingness to blend Christian and Native American spiritual practices demonstrated the pragmatic approach that frontier communities often took when facing challenges that exceeded their cultural resources. However, their incomplete understanding of the forces they were attempting to appease would soon prove to have consequences that extended far beyond their intentions. The morning after the purification attempt revealed that the ritual had indeed affected the river, though not in ways the participants had hoped. The water's surface, previously completely black and non-reflective, now showed distorted images that seemed to move independently of any earthly source. Settlers approaching the riverbanks could see shapes and figures writhing beneath the surface, as if the ceremony had made visible the spiritual entities that had previously remained hidden in the depths. Reverend Blackwood, who had led the ritual, suffered the most dramatic consequences of their intervention. The normally articulate preacher found himself speaking in tongues during his Sunday sermon, uttering phrases in what linguists would later identify as archaic Native American dialects. His congregation sat in stunned silence as their spiritual leader delivered messages he couldn't understand. His eyes rolled back and his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond his physical form. Other participants experienced their own disturbing after-effects that suggested the ceremony had opened spiritual channels they weren't prepared to handle. Sarah Mitchell began experiencing prophetic dreams that showed future events with disturbing accuracy, while blacksmith John Crawford found that metal objects would spontaneously heat up in his presence. These manifestations of supernatural ability came with severe physical and emotional costs that left the affected individuals weakened and disoriented. The failed purification attempt had apparently amplified rather than resolved the supernatural disturbances surrounding the cursed river. Community members reported increased spiritual activity throughout the settlement, with unexplained sounds, moving objects, and strange lights becoming common occurrences. The boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds had become even more permeable, creating conditions that would define the area's reputation for generations of future settlers. Dr. Thornton documented these phenomena with clinical precision, creating what would become valuable historical records of supernatural events during America's westward expansion. His medical training provided a framework for observing and recording symptoms of spiritual affliction, contributing to the growing body of documented ghost stories and true horror stories that characterized frontier life in territories where European cultural understanding encountered forces beyond conventional explanation. By autumn of 1851, the supernatural disturbances had become so severe that several families began making preparations to abandon their homesteads and seek safer territories. The decision to leave represented enormous sacrifice, as these settlers had invested everything they owned in their Montana Territory claims. However, the psychological toll of living near the cursed river had become unbearable, particularly for families with children who seemed especially sensitive to the supernatural influences emanating from the dark waters. The first family to depart was the Hendersons, whose patriarch had been one of the original prospectors to work the river. Martha Henderson, the schoolteacher, had documented extensive supernatural encounters that convinced her family the situation would only worsen with time. Their departure created a ripple effect throughout the community. as other families began questioning whether their determination to remain was wisdom or stubborn pride that put their loved ones at risk. Those who chose to stay faced increasingly difficult conditions as community resources dwindled with each departing family. Essential services became harder to maintain with fewer people to share responsibilities, while the psychological burden of remaining intensified as the supernatural activity seemed to focus more intensely on the shrinking population. The departure of level-headed community members left behind a concentration of either the most determined or the most affected individuals. The exodus created practical challenges that compounded the supernatural ones, as departing families needed to sell their properties and livestock quickly, often at significant losses. However, finding buyers proved nearly impossible once word of the supernatural disturbances spread to neighboring settlements. The cursed river had effectively destroyed the economic value of the entire area, trapping remaining residents in a place they increasingly feared but couldn't easily leave. This period of community dissolution represented a common pattern in Western horror stories, where supernatural forces ultimately succeeded in driving away human settlement. The Montana Territory River situation became a cautionary tale shared among frontier communities, contributing to American folklore traditions that warned of the dangers inherent in disturbing ancient spiritual sites during the expansion into lands where Dark West legends were born from real experiences. The winter of 1851-1852 brought the settlement's remaining residents face to face with their final confrontation with the supernatural forces that had plagued them for over 2 years. Only a dozen families remained, huddled in their cabins, while outside, the cursed river had frozen into a surface so perfectly black it seemed to absorb even the light from their oil lamps. The ice never reflected the aurora borealis that danced overhead, creating an unnatural void in the winter landscape that filled observers with existential dread. Dr. Thornton continued documenting phenomena with scientific precision even as his own sanity began to fray under the constant supernatural pressure. His medical journals from this period reveal a man struggling to maintain rational thought while witnessing events that challenged every aspect of his scientific training. Patients arrived with ailments that defied medical explanation, while the doctor himself began experiencing symptoms he couldn't diagnose or treat using conventional methods available on the frontier. Reverend Blackwood's condition had deteriorated significantly since the failed purification ceremony, and he now spent hours standing by the frozen river, delivering sermons to invisible congregations in languages he had never learned. His wife Mary watched helplessly as her husband communicated with entities that seemed to speak through him, using his voice to deliver messages that carried profound spiritual weight, but came at the cost of his individual identity and sanity. The remaining children in the settlement displayed increasingly unusual behavior that worried their parents beyond measure. They would gather at windows facing the river, speaking in whispers about friends who played beneath the ice, describing elaborate games and conversations with entities that adults couldn't see. These phantom playmates seemed to be drawing the children deeper into the supernatural realm that had consumed the entire area around the cursed waters. As winter deepened and isolation increased, the boundary between reality and supernatural experience became so blurred that survivors could no longer distinguish between natural hardships and spiritual affliction. This final winter represented the culmination of the Dark West experience, where frontier challenges merged with supernatural horror to create conditions that would forever mark the survivors and contribute to the historical horror legacy of American westward expansion. Young Timothy Crawford, the blacksmith's son who had been only 8 years old when the supernatural disturbances began, became the settlement's final witness to the river's ultimate revelation. Now 10 and marked by experiences that had aged him far beyond his years, Timothy possessed a child's natural sensitivity to spiritual phenomena, combined with a survivor's hard-earned wisdom about the dangers that surrounded his community. His innocent perspective captured truths that adults, burdened by rationality and fear, often missed or deliberately ignored. On a particularly clear February night, Timothy witnessed what he would later describe as the river's final message to the living world. The ice suddenly became transparent, revealing the depths that had remained hidden for years beneath the dark surface. He saw a vast underwater landscape filled with structures that resembled buildings, streets, and gathering places, as if an entire community existed beneath the cursed waters where supernatural entities had created their own settlement. The boy observed hundreds of translucent figures moving through this underwater realm, and he recognized some of them as people who had died in the area over the past several years. They seemed to be going about their daily lives in this spiritual community, but their activities were focused around preparing for some kind of significant event. Timothy sensed that these entities were waiting for something, and their patient vigil had a purpose that would soon be revealed to the living world. Most remarkably, Timothy reported that one of the underwater figures approached the ice from below and gestured for him to come closer. When he pressed his small hand against the frozen surface, he felt warmth emanating from the spiritual realm beneath, and he heard a voice speaking directly into his mind. The message was simple but profound. The river had been trying to communicate, not threaten, and the living community had misunderstood the nature of the supernatural encounters they had experienced. Timothy's revelation represented a breakthrough in understanding the true nature of the cursed river's phenomena, suggesting that the supernatural disturbances had been attempts at communication rather than malevolent attacks. This child's perspective would later contribute to American folklore traditions that recognized the complexity of spiritual encounters on the frontier, where ghost stories often contained messages that required innocent wisdom to interpret correctly. Spring of 1852 brought unprecedented warmth to Montana Territory, melting the winter ice with unusual speed and violence. The cursed river swelled beyond its normal banks, carrying with it debris that included objects from decades past, mining equipment that had been lost years earlier, personal belongings of settlers who had died, and strangest of all, items that seemed to belong to cultures that had occupied the land long before white settlement. The flood waters revealed that the river had been collecting and preserving artifacts from everyone who had ever lived near its banks. As the ice broke apart, witnesses reported seeing images frozen within the chunks, faces, scenes, and moments preserved like photographs in the crystalline structure. These ice-bound visions showed events from throughout the river's troubled history, from Native American ceremonies to mining accidents to the supernatural encounters that had plagued the settlement. The breaking ice seemed to be releasing stored memories, allowing observers to witness the accumulated spiritual history of the cursed waters. Dr. Thornton, despite his deteriorating mental state, recognized the scientific significance of what was occurring and attempted to document the phenomena with his remaining photographic equipment. The images he captured showed distortions and anomalies that seemed to reveal spiritual activity invisible to the naked eye. His photographs became some of the earliest documented evidence of supernatural phenomena in American frontier territories, contributing to the historical record of true horror stories from the westward expansion period. The flood waters carried their supernatural cargo downstream, spreading the river's influence across a much wider area of the territory. Reports began arriving from distant settlements about strange objects washing up along riverbanks, carrying with them the spiritual energy that had been concentrated at the original site. The cursed river was sharing its accumulated power with other waterways, creating a network of supernatural influence across the expanding frontier landscape. Reverend Blackwood, in one of his brief moments of clarity, proclaimed that the thaw represented a form of spiritual cleansing, not the removal of supernatural forces, but their proper distribution according to some cosmic plan beyond human understanding. His interpretation suggested that the river had been gathering spiritual energy for a purpose that was finally being fulfilled, transforming the local crisis into a broader phenomenon that would influence the development of Western horror traditions across multiple territories. As the flood waters receded and spring settled into the valley, the true nature of the river's curse finally became clear to the remaining settlers. The dark waters had returned to their normal level, but now they reflected light naturally for the first time in 3 years. However, the reflections showed more than just the sky and surrounding landscape. They revealed glimpses of the past, present, and future that helped survivors understand the spiritual forces they had been encountering throughout their ordeal in the territory. Timothy Crawford's innocent interpretation had been correct. The supernatural entities had been trying to communicate rather than threaten the living community. The river served as a spiritual repository where the memories and experiences of everyone who had ever lived near its waters were preserved and processed by entities tasked with maintaining the boundary between life and death. The settlers' mining activities and casual use of the sacred site had disrupted this ancient system, creating the supernatural chaos they had experienced. Professor Whitmore, who had returned to study the river's transformation, discovered that the water's unusual properties had normalized, but retained subtle characteristics that defied scientific explanation. His instruments detected trace elements that shouldn't exist naturally, suggesting that the supernatural events had permanently altered the river's fundamental nature. The boundary between natural and supernatural had been permanently shifted, creating what he termed a new category of natural phenomenon in his research reports. The surviving settlers began to understand that their community had been chosen to serve as witnesses to forces beyond ordinary human experience, contributing to the growing body of American folklore that would define frontier spiritual traditions. Their ordeal had been both curse and privilege, marking them as carriers of knowledge about the supernatural realities that existed alongside the physical challenges of westward expansion into territories where Dark West legends originated from actual encounters. Chief Standing Bear's prediction had been fulfilled. The spiritual imbalance had been corrected, but through suffering and understanding rather than simple appeasement. The remaining community members found themselves forever changed by their experiences, carrying within themselves a deep awareness of the spiritual dimensions of frontier life that would influence their descendants for generations. Their story became part of the historical horror tradition that documented the supernatural challenges faced by those who dared to settle in lands where ancient spiritual forces remained active and powerful. The 8 families who remained through the river's supernatural crisis formed what they called the Covenant of Witnesses, pledging to preserve and protect the knowledge they had gained through their harrowing experiences. Led by the now recovered Reverend Blackwood and guided by Dr. Thornton's meticulous documentation, they established protocols for future settlers who might encounter similar supernatural phenomena throughout the expanding American frontier territories. Their agreement represented one of the first organized attempts to create systematic approaches for dealing with supernatural challenges in the Western expansion. The Covenant members agreed to serve as advisors and counselors for other communities facing unexplained phenomena, sharing their hard-earned wisdom about the intersection of spiritual and physical realities on the frontier. They developed practical guidelines for identifying supernatural activity, assessing potential dangers, and implementing appropriate responses that respected both Christian beliefs and indigenous spiritual traditions. Their hybrid approach reflected the cultural adaptation necessary for survival in territories where multiple worldviews converged. Timothy Crawford, now recognized as having special sensitivity to spiritual phenomena, was designated as the community's primary interpreter for supernatural encounters. Despite his youth, his innocent perspective and natural ability to communicate with spiritual entities made him invaluable for understanding the intentions and needs of supernatural forces. The adults committed to protecting and nurturing his abilities while ensuring he received proper education to balance his spiritual gifts with practical frontier skills. Dr. Thornton established what became the territory's first documented archive of supernatural phenomena, carefully cataloging every aspect of their 3-year ordeal with the Cursed River. His medical and scientific training provided a framework for objective documentation that would prove invaluable to future researchers studying the supernatural dimensions of American frontier experience. His archive became a cornerstone resource for understanding historical horror events throughout the westward expansion period. The Covenant of Witnesses represented a significant development in American folklore tradition, creating formal structures for preserving and transmitting knowledge about supernatural encounters and that had previously existed only in oral traditions. Their systematic approach to documenting and understanding spiritual phenomena contributed to the evolution of uniquely American ghost stories rooted in the specific challenges and experiences of frontier life, in territories where European cultural understanding encountered forces beyond conventional explanation. By autumn of 1852, the Cursed River had become a pilgrimage site for people throughout the territory seeking answers to their own supernatural encounters. Word had spread through frontier communication networks about the successful resolution of the supernatural crisis, attracting visitors who hoped to learn from the survivors' experiences. The river's transformation from a source of terror to a place of spiritual learning represented a unique chapter in the development of American frontier spirituality and Western horror traditions. The settlement slowly began to recover and grow as new families arrived, drawn not by gold or land speculation, but by the community's reputation for understanding and managing supernatural phenomena. These new residents brought their own stories of unexplained encounters from across the expanding frontier, creating a repository of American folklore that documented the spiritual challenges faced by settlers throughout the westward expansion period. The community became a beacon for those seeking to understand the supernatural dimensions of frontier life. Professor Whitmore established a permanent research station near the river, attracting scholars and investigators from Eastern universities who were beginning to recognize the scientific value of studying supernatural phenomena. His work contributed to the emerging field of paranormal research, providing systematic methodologies for documenting and analyzing experiences that challenge conventional scientific understanding. The Montana Territory site became one of America's first formal centers for supernatural research and education. The river itself continued to serve as a bridge between physical and spiritual realities, but now in a controlled and beneficial manner that served the community's needs. Visitors reported receiving guidance and healing through respectful interaction with the spiritual forces that remained present in the sacred waters. The dark surface that had once reflected nothing now showed visitors glimpses of truth and wisdom that helped them navigate both supernatural and practical challenges of frontier existence. The transformation of the cursed river into a source of spiritual guidance represented a significant achievement in the development of uniquely American approaches to supernatural phenomena. The community's success in establishing harmony between living setters and spiritual entities created a model that would influence how future frontier communities dealt with similar challenges throughout territories where the expansion of European American civilization encountered ancient spiritual forces that demanded respect and understanding. As our story draws to its close in the winter of 1852, the river that once drank moonlight and reflected nothing had become a mirror of truth that revealed the souls of those who gazed into its depths. The dark waters now showed each visitor exactly what they needed to see, sometimes comfort, sometimes challenge, always wisdom earned through suffering and understanding. The supernatural crisis had transformed both the river and the community into something greater than either could have become alone, creating a legacy that would influence American folklore for generations. The children who had survived the supernatural ordeal grew into adults carrying within themselves a deep understanding of the spiritual dimensions of frontier life that would serve them throughout their lives. Timothy Crawford became a respected spiritual advisor who traveled throughout the territory helping other communities navigate supernatural challenges, while other survivor children contributed to their communities as healers, teachers, and interpreters of the mysterious forces that seemed to follow American expansion westwards into ancient lands. The story of the river that drank the moon became one of the foundational legends of Western horror tradition, passed down through generations of frontier families who faced their own supernatural challenges in territories where the boundary between natural and spiritual remained fluid and dangerous. The tale served both as warning and encouragement, showing that supernatural forces could be understood and even befriended through courage, wisdom, and respect for the spiritual traditions of all peoples who had lived on the land. Modern visitors to the area report that the river continues to hold unusual properties, though now they manifest as healing and guidance, rather than terror and confusion. The water reflects not just images, but emotions and memories, helping people understand their own spiritual journeys and connections to the land that has witnessed so much human struggle and transformation. The supernatural legacy continues to serve as a bridge between past and present, connecting contemporary Americans with the spiritual challenges faced by their frontier ancestors. If you've been drawn to this tale of supernatural frontier life, consider exploring more story from America's Dark West tradition. where real historical events merged with spiritual forces to create uniquely American horror experiences. Like and subscribe to hear more true stories from the territories where our ancestors faced challenges that tested not just their physical courage, but their understanding of the spiritual forces that shape human destiny. The river still flows, still reflects, still remembers, and still has lessons to teach those brave enough to look into its depths and see the truth reflected there.